in the
Exactly.
mid-'80s.
Yeah,
That was quite a correlation.
yeah, and right when Saturn, it would have been well, there would have been Saturn and I guess Saturn and Pluto would have been in both in Scorpio, right when it really probably yeah, right around when like Rock Hudson made his announcement.
Was that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
So that's the threshold that's being echoed right now with Saturn having gone into Scorpio. So that's interesting.
and there was another story today in the news. I only had a chance to look at it briefly, but it sounded like a computer STD spread through pacemakers. And this is the strangest thing. I mean, it makes sense for the Uranus Pluto years, which for
Totally. That's right.
and it was like this a computer hacker guy, but like he's like a professional hacker, not just like some guy in his basement.
Uh-huh.
Had designed this virus that he could be like on his laptop and load it up to any pacemaker within 30 feet,
Oh, my
and
gosh.
then that he could get into the company server. This passwords were all stored on the pacemaker, and then he could load up a virus. And this is where it resembled AIDS, which I thought was the strangest thing. They could load it up, and then that person who's now got the virus inside their pacemaker could then pass it to other pacemakers anywhere they walk, and but the virus wouldn't necessarily go off for say 6 months or a year. So
Oh,
kind of like
boy.
HIV, a person could spread it and then not know that they're spreading it because it's
That's
a
amazing.
yeah.
It's so much like the whole Matrix idea. I mean, it's so something that you would think would come out in a movie. And this business of a virus being named, being given that word, a computer virus having the same name as an epidemic of microorganisms. This thing sounds like it's playing that out exactly.
Yeah, by the way, I did the chart for the first computer virus. I don't remember too much other than it had Mars at 0 degrees Aries.
Ah, the
So that,
PowerPoint.
yeah, that seemed rather fitting. But
How did you come to that, Matt?
um,
That
it just I was fascinated by the history of technology and computers, and
How did you determine which one would have been the first?
oh, it was there was one in 1988 that started at MIT, and it's considered to be the first computer virus.
Huh.
So
What did they call it?
I don't remember, but if you just Google first computer virus, and like the
Wow.
guy loaded it up and having no idea, had no expectation that it would create the damage that it did.
Wow.
And this was like in the early days of not the early days of the internet, but relatively, before regular people had the internet.
Yeah.
And so in the news, there's still videos of it on YouTube of the news stories, and people are like, it's kind of like a virus, but for computers.
Yeah.
And
That was it was just hitting them that
yeah.
concept. Well, I do think that Uranus square Pluto, which we're under, is going to involve breakthroughs in ways of thinking about technology and also the dark side of technology. So I think that story is a good one for, a big learning curve that we're in right now with technology.
Do you have any? Is there any hope? This is my feeling. Even though I've used the internet for basically my entire adult life to actually make a living, I still think that cell phones are a fad, and this any day now people are going to wake up.
Wow.
And do you think we're ever going back to the days of landlines, or is that just my?
Well, I can't. I always go back to this nagging question that am surprised that nobody else is sort of asking in print, which is, what happens when the power goes off? What happens that the world is run by computers? In Y2K, you might remember these were the fears that were explored. People were freaking out the fact that everything, like opening a door in a bank, everything is computerized. And actually, there's a new TV show showing, I haven't seen it, but the pilot has the lights going out all over the world when
Yeah.
there's this massive power failure, and planes are spiraling down from the sky. And I'm thinking, as a writer, about the information that's now all digitalized. If there's some kind of an apocalyptic wipeout of the way that we experience power now, what would happen to future generations trying to understand our records? They can't look at clay tablets with cuneiform on them, They can't even look at this old ancient parchment that we're still reading from classical Greece and Tudor England, right? it'll be stored in something that you can't access without the proper machines and without the power.
Yeah, I sometimes wonder if the in 500 years, assuming there's some survivors of whatever's going to happen, that if to them the attack on 9/11 will be like, if you know the Tower of Babel story, which, by the way, they used oil to construct towers in that area of the world. They actually used oil seeps and I'm like, oh, wow, the Tower of Babel, which is actually probably a metaphor for the collapse of an economy, a growth-based economy.
Yeah.
We have something similar when the day the World Trade Towers came down was kind of like, of course, tied into oil because it's tied into stuff in the Middle East. And I wonder if in 500 years that story will get told kind of the way the Tower of Babel story gets told.
Yeah, that's very, very interesting. I think that the mythic status of 9/11 is a very useful symbol for us. You know, we who read archetypes, and, you know, not just for the conventional reasons of seeing the significance of that day, but the chart of 9/11, which has been well studied by astrologers. And to isolate out the influence of Saturn in there and the influence of Pluto in there as a precursor to what's going on right now with the Uranus-Pluto square. You know, that singular date, 9/11/2001, is kind of like a paradigm date. And the transits of that incredible chart, which was, Pluto was right on the ascendant of the USA, and it was exactly opposite Saturn, which is on the descendant, which is foreign policy. And like you say, the petropolitics of foreign policy. That chart kind of began the era of oil wars, or at least I wouldn't say it began it, of course, but that was when the concept of oil wars broke through the crust of collective consciousness and started getting played out.
Jessica, are you to say that we went into Iraq for something other than democracy?
Say that again.
I said, are you saying that we went into Iraq for something other than to do with democracy?
Yes, sir. I would say I'm saying that.
I'm being facetious with you.
I know, but I think that's the deal. I think the era we're in right now, which 9/11/2001 inaugurated, and which the Uranus square Pluto years are ramping up and playing out, is an era where the majority of people are now skeptical of the Iraq War. The majority get about what's going on with U.S. occupations of Afghanistan and so on. And along with this, they get what the banks are doing. They get how financial institutions are corrupt and have to do with what went down in 2008. I'm saying the majority now get it, and they get how the environmental issues play in with this more than they ever have before.
It's interesting, even people who are very what you might call right-wing or Republican or whatever, even they have woken up to things like, okay, maybe it's not socially acceptable for them to, quote, believe in global warming, but they will at least acknowledge that the environment is being poisoned by chemicals. Yeah. They'll go there, that the plastics are affecting, testosterone production. And they probably would be willing to go to the global warming, understand global warming, but in some communities it's not socially acceptable to say that. So they can't.
Religious trip. Yeah, but it's true that when you back up from the nonsense that gets bandied back and forth in these little partisan groups, and you see the human learning curve from this big perspective of, like, this Uranus-Pluto square, you start to see that there are massive shifts that happen. And, of course, there's always going to be people ahead of the curve, and there's always going to be people in the middle. It's always like a bell curve of consciousness. But that the shift that we're talking about now in this modern oil war era is inevitably turning to critique of the political economic system, which is the Pluto and Capricorn signature. That the huge overriding understanding has shifted, that there's something rotten in Denmark.
For
And, they're even, like you say, the right wing, they're even wary of their own conventional party politics. People are getting wrenched out of the blasé attitude in general.
Yeah, absolutely. The more people get kicked to the fringes or begin feeling that they may get kicked to the fringes, they start waking up. They start looking for explanations as to why that is, and then in some cases they seek out astrology as a tool for explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's right.
you mentioned the Uranus Pluto. Now, of course, I know what that means, and people who listen to the show regularly or read your blog regularly, have an idea of what that means. But for folks whose astrological literacy has yet to fully express itself, could you give a quick rundown of what we mean when we say the Uranus-Pluto years? And
I will.
Does this explain why everybody's losing their minds, or they?
Yeah, that's right. I have a whole book on that one subject. It's called At the Crossroads, and it came out this year at the First Exactitude. It's called At the Crossroads. An astrologer talks about these turbulent times. And, really we can say I cover the years 2008 to 2023, and I call those the years of the Cardinal Cross. But there's a peak period within those years, which is 2012 to 2015, which is when Uranus in the sky is forming an exact 90-degree angle with Pluto in the sky. And Uranus is the planet of wrenching, revolutionary growth spurts in terms of consciousness that people think of as a waking up, a relatively shocking and abrupt lurch, in where the mass mind is at. And it also governs technology. And the fact that it's square, meaning it's, a quarter of the sky away from the position that transiting Pluto is now occupying, means that it's those waking up energies, which are very exciting and very disruptive, are slamming up against the most taboo issues of our day, because Pluto governs clandestine information and underground stuff and literal taboos. And so there is this cold water in the face happening with the world in general, of course, not just the USA, although it plays a major role in it that we can talk about, but all the most juicy, hard to talk about issues that really represent a world in decay are now coming out of the woodwork, and it's very exciting.
Yeah, well, it's exciting for many, those of us who are at least keyed in. I've noticed there's people who are resistant to this stuff. They're doubling down on the denial.
That's right.
Are literally, and I can see it from people's Facebook posts, they're literally losing their minds because everything they believed in 5 years ago, 10 years ago is not working.
That's right.
But they're still clinging to it because they're hopped up on the narcosis from the media, oftentimes antidepressants also, which I think contribute to an inability to process reality.
That's right.
And they're literally going crazy. And those of us who do know about this stuff, I'm going crazy myself, but at least
that's right.
It's somewhat.
It's really not an easy haul.
It's somewhat under control.
I think that, my belief is that we all, as souls, made a decision to incarnate into this particular era for our own mysterious karmic reasons, some of which you can infer from our birth charts what our learning curve was meant to be so that we could learn very specific culturally linked lessons along with the rest of the collective. But to remember or to hold the meaning of our being here right now with that kind of a space, to see the meaningfulness in being here and being part of these times, puts a very different spin on how we would go about contributing and participating to them, not just reacting to them. It doesn't make it easier. These transits are not easy in any stretch of the imagination. But we know from dealing with only personal transits to the individual chart, that those tough ones, those squares and oppositions, especially with the outer planets, they are life-transforming. And I think that's what we could all use, not only to stay healthy in these years that we just talked about, but to flourish, to come into our own. I think we have to get into little daily meditations, little whatever mnemonic a given person uses to keep in mind that perspective as often as we can. Am I making sense?
Oh, yeah. This gentleman who just set the skydiving record, Felix Baumgartner.
Uh-huh.
Now, I was thinking that might be a good... it was kind of a Uranus-Pluto square.
Totally, yeah.
And
I thought of that.
Yeah. He's, by the way, an Aries Sun, Gemini Moon.
Oh, boy.
Same. I call it the skydiver and the high flyer, the loose cannon and the live wire.
Yeah, that's great.
Same as...
that's his way of participating.
Yeah. By the way,
that's his way of coming into his own.
Yeah, San Francisco is an Aries Sun, Gemini Moon. And,
well, there's different opinions on that. Is that the one you used, and have you found it to work?
Yeah, I thought it seemed to fit because, the final thing that did it for me is Betty Davis, the actress. She's an Aries Sun, Gemini Moon.
Uh-huh.
And she's actually an icon among the gay world for gay
right.
men.
Uh-huh.
And I'm like, well, maybe it makes sense.
I see. There's a parallel there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And driving around San Francisco, Jesse James, the motorcycle guy,
don't know him.
Oh, Sandra Bullock's lover who...
Oh, yeah, right.
He's an Aries Sun, Gemini Moon. And I'm like, there is a flourishing outlaw biker scene of sorts in San Francisco.
Also Dykes on bikes.
And by the way, they are a Cancer Sun, Libra Moon.
You are great with these group charts, the mundane charts. Yeah.
But it's a Pluto. They have their moon is exactly conjunct Pluto. So it's kind of expressing as a Scorpio moon.
Huh.
So,
and what would their Pluto be in the natal chart?
It was Libra, 1976.
Okay.
So,
wow.
Yeah, Derek Jeter is a Cancer Sun, Libra moon, and I thought, there's actually some similarity, very social combination.
Those are great parallels to watch. They really show you how these things work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been interested in Pluto, even as I was just learning astrology, because it's the dirt, man. It's really the interesting stuff that's going on underneath. And so there's this idea that these institutions that many of us grew up with thinking that they were immutable, that they would never change, that they were the Rock of Gibraltar of reality, to have those be crumbling right now, that's a huge psychological, mass psychology, destabilization. That, as you say, it's rupturing the very definition of what sanity is.
Well,
I think we have to back up, even from concepts like sanity. I think that we have to be open now to the idea that there might even be a new definition of what it means to be normal, what it means to be sane in times like this.
Yeah, was it Hunter Thompson who said when the world goes weird, the weird go pro?
That's fantastic.
And I'm like, well, that's been true for me my whole life.
I love it. That is so good.
I think there was there was a line in Terminator, like something about an insane world, maybe only the sane, are the insane the sane or something? And
yeah, I do think that's what's happening. And I think that astrologically we can chalk that up to outer planet transits, because those are the three, and Chiron too maybe, but all the planets beyond Saturn's orbit, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto especially, are the ones that signify the kind of shift in the mass definition of normalcy that make these transitional periods so threatening to so many people. But all we're really doing is redefining normalcy. And I think if we can get with that idea, we can allow, the higher message of what these planets are trying to teach, to allow that in. Instead of just allowing ourselves to freak out and have these big dramas, our freaking out reaction be the plot line. That's really just a symptom.
Have you seen these things? This is like one of the booming mini sectors of the economy. They're like these survival races. Like there's one, it's like a 20-mile obstacle course, and you're actually chased by zombies. So they hire actors or like people to sign up.
Oh no,
And
that is amazing.
yeah, what's it called? The zombie race or something. And there's like 10 of these. There's the warrior dash, there's the tough mudder, and they all involve
the tough
like
mudder is that, yeah.
yeah, the zombie one is the one I thought about doing because it's a little shorter. It's like only 3 miles as opposed to 20. And
it's only zombies.
What's that?
And it's only zombies.
Well, no, it's an obstacle course, but you're chased by zombies. But the guys who have done all of these things they're doing very, very well financially.
Oh, that's amazing! And what a sign of the times.
Yeah, and I was like, well, is this we have all these horrible things going on and unemployment and so on and so forth, and people are really depressed and scared, and rightfully so. But it's not all doom and gloom. And I thought the zombie races and the tough mudder, they're fun, they're social, it's good to get out and run around, and people train for it in groups.
They're a way of acting out the zeitgeist and it's better, and in general, it's more healthy to act something out than to repress it. I mean, the alternative to not expressing it in one of these zany ways is to go into some very troubling denial, like you were talking about before, which is unhealthful, as well as being politically incorrect, spiritually incorrect.
Right, and something I've noticed that with if this is not, well, I guess it did get talked about when Saturn was in Libra, but we have these economic shifts and environmental issues, and people are experiencing those. The economic stuff, they can just look at their checkbook or their bank statement or their unemployment, or their either their paycheck or their unemployment check or whatever it is they're getting or not getting. And environment, all they have to do is look outside. But what about on relationships? Because there's a lot of marriages and long-term relationships that may have been initially established 10 years ago, where if the couple, or 20 years ago, if the couple was in the white upper middle class, the system still worked for them. And most people who see
although it's half and half now.
Right.
Fewer and fewer people, even from that socioeconomic group, are getting married. And they're getting married later and later.
Right.
That institution is really changing.
So what I sometimes, I guess what I'm trying to say is, do you see people who the economic and environmental effects are, their relationships were established with certain assumptions 20 years ago that are no longer valid, economic and social assumptions, and that's really kind of wreaking havoc with people's relationships?
Yeah, not to mention the unconscious sexual assumptions of, symbolized by a woman getting married in a white gown and the father giving her away. I mean, people aren't really looking, I don't think, at what traditions those reflect. They're so out of touch with the reality of contemporary sexual mores and with what the person who's walking down the aisle really believes. So that's an example, one more example of an institution, which is Capricorn, that is being Plutonized, which is to say the distance between what the institution is supposed to reflect and what's really going on is getting so big, so gaping, that these institutions are rotting from the core. And I think that people are very dislocated with that. And what they do is, many of them, like you said, they grab on even tighter to the institutions. Like marriage, to glorify it in some old-fashioned way. They would call it old-fashioned, but to try to ignore how it doesn't match their actual lives and their actual ideologies anymore. And when we do that, we get cognitive dissonance. It's not a healthy way to behave. Anyway, you were talking about relationships.
Yeah,
I also think electronics comes in here. The technology of having these tiny little portable devices, which many people, sociologists, are saying are undermining human relationship, undermining real emotional heart engagement. All this relating, so-called, that is done through this little device that you get locked into. I mean, the device becomes your whole world.
Yeah, there's people like I have a cell phone. It's a prepaid cell phone. It costs $10. I barely use it.
Yeah.
And if I lost it, I really wouldn't care. There's no information on it. Like there's 5 people on it that I call, and like
Yeah.
I could lose it and not. I wouldn't freak out for 2 seconds, other than to have to go call those 5 people on a new $10 cell phone.
It's not your world.
But I know people who, boy, they lost their cell phone. Their whole life would be like
Their
over.
whole life is on it.
Yeah.
And there's a new film out. I haven't seen it. I don't know if it's come out yet. Disconnected, with Jason Bateman and Paula Patton. I was reading about this, that talks about various people whose lives are negatively affected by the Internet. And Mick LaSalle of the San Francisco Chronicle says it's like contagion, only it's the Internet, not a virus. And it makes you think that I see this as a part of the Uranus-Pluto square, which is exposing the dark side, the deeper implications of technology, which has been so fast that, it is one of the revolutions that this period is famous for. It's a cultural revolution. I'm saying that in parts of the world where there isn't a full-blown hot war, there are all these cultural wars going on.
Well, I almost had a cultural war in the car about 3 weeks ago. A friend of mine and I were going out. It was actually to an astrology party of all things, and I had written out directions to where we were going, like the very, very old school way, like on a piece of paper with a pen. My friend had an iPhone that would tell you, it was like, turn left at such and such. And the thing, I wanted to use my directions, which I had written down.
Good idea.
And my friend insisted on using the iPhone. And I couldn't read my own handwriting, so I eventually had to say, okay, fine, we'll use the iPhone. But there was an interesting moment of tension there where I've got the old school handwritten directions, and we're kind of competing, and there was also a subtle male-female thing there of like who's right, And then luckily I couldn't read my writing, so I had an excuse to go ahead and default to the iPhone. But I thought, that's kind of a interesting there. I still use the old school maps. I have all the old school maps.
Well, we're hearing now about all these situations where they get into real dangerous trouble if you just go by the computerized way, because common sense doesn't come into it.
Right.
But I think that this is also Pluto, which is showing us the shadow of this particular revolution. When social networking got skewered by that wonderful movie, Social Network,
right,
about Zuckerberg, that was another cultural milestone, I think, where the psychosociological impact of this way of relating was looked at. For the first time, everybody was thinking the same type of thoughts. There's an aura of intimacy that goes on with this constantly being in touch business of social networking. Now you can tell how my generation still finds it marvelously, hideously fascinating.
I agree, by the way. I'm 34, so I'm in the age.
Yeah, I know. I think it's, it's bodiless, and it's, what did somebody say? Everybody's a celebrity. Close encounters, everybody's a celebrity. Everybody gets to initiate their socializing through this little machine. And somebody brought up the point, which I thought was really good, that as Karl Marx suggested, that in the capitalist age we begin to treat one another as commodities. That movie, this view of the social networking, suggests that we're now treating each other as packets of information. That's a purely Uranian concept of just little buzzing balls of information. Uranus is actually a mental planet.
They did an article speaking of handling people, human beings, like just digits.
Yeah.
Of course, people now use the online personals to meet other singles, and that got going when we had the Uranus-Neptune mutual reception, which is kind of a fantasy thing.
Yeah.
There's an element of fantasy there. And there was an article in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, within the last year, that the dating sites, a lot of them have kind of maxed out. And people, if you ever go on one of these sites, everybody says in their profile, or not everybody, but a lot of people, I'm on here because I'm tired of the bar scene. And what it turns out
Nobody
now,
goes to bars anymore.
well, no, what's happening now, people are so tired of being treated like packets of information, they're actually going back to the bars.
Yeah,
So
that makes sense, doesn't it?
yeah, because at least at a
You
bar.
know, I was reading around the time when Pluto went into Capricorn and this whole questioning began. There was this Chapel Hill professor who wrote software, did you hear about this, that enables people to shut off their access to the Internet for up to 8 hours.
Oh, yeah.
It's a program called Freedom, Uranus. And it had, 75,000 users. There's a part of people who are hungry for this because it has turned into an aspect of slavery.
Yeah, sometimes it's interesting. There's been people who have apologized for not getting back to me like in one day. And I always write back, I'm like, well, I figure like unless it's an emergency, like 3 days is totally fine.
Yeah, the time has been stepped up.
Yeah.
And this is another thing that I think astrologers can look at about the wider implications of Uranus, which is the first planet beyond Saturn. If you don't consider Chiron, it's beyond Saturn, which governs chronological time. And that placement in the solar system of Uranus being the first one to challenge everything that Saturn represents means that part of the definition of Uranus is to blow apart the assumptions of chronological time. And I'm looking at the way that, I talk about all of this in my book, At the Crossroads, about how there is a new approach to time in the mass mind. For one thing, all discussion about time has to be a discussion about technological change and the speed of it right now, because this is one of the biggest ways we measure time passing. But it's also on a person-to-person basis, our concept of time in our own little world has been revolutionized. I mean, it's revolutionized daily life and, like you say, the speed with which we communicate. And somebody said it's altered the rhythm of our minds. I think that's very good. We have no idea the effects on the neurology of our brains, although tests are starting to be, being done on this, all packed into this relatively short little time span of years that we've had since the, computers jumped into everybody's pockets, which I think, by the way, we can use the Uranus-Neptune conjunction in 1993. You remember that? The last big outer planet transit, the most recently since the one now. That, I think, is the time when what happened that you were talking about before happened, which is that this riff of computer use completely took over.
Yeah, I remember I was 15 at the time, and or maybe 14. I was in my freshman biology class, and the class next door had an internet connection, and they were exchanging information with Russia, somebody in Russia or something. I just thought it was the most amazing thing, and that would have been right during that. It would have been like in '93, actually. And so
well, this brings in the idea when you look at the way the different superpowers are handling the internet, or the whole notion of internet freedom. Russia and China, are already censoring. Many of different cultures are, and the ways that the USA censors, which are, couched in this patriotic language, anti-terrorism language, those are the ways that we as Americans have to keep our eyes peeled for. National governments with the institutional mechanisms to regulate and restrict and censor and watch, surveillance. We have to keep our eyes on this. They have the police forces and the armies and the thousands of regulators to be the threat to internet freedom.
Yeah,
I don't know if you've heard about, or if your listeners are hip to these dreadful bills that are going out, which, that are being passed in Washington, which nobody seems to be paying attention to.
Oh, I've been paying very close attention because it's a thing where you start to be concerned where if if you link to something that you think is totally perfectly okay to link to, you would never. And some of these bills make it where like you can be doing something totally reasonable and innocent, and the way some of these bills are worded, now you're in deep trouble and it's some type of criminal violation,
Mm-hmm.
and it's
Or
like
you could be branded a terrorist.
yeah, you click on a link or something, and that's it into your normal existence, and so I've been paying very close attention. The only problem is it's very overwhelming. At a certain point, there's so many there's so many things going on of such import that it actually can get overwhelming to the
that's
psyche.
true. Everybody, I think, has to come up against that fact that just the sheer amount of information is almost by definition overwhelming. And there needs to be perspective. And this is one of the things that astrology provides so well, because it breaks down this tsunami of information, much of it troubling, that we're getting from the mass media, which really we need to distance ourselves tremendously from that while still keeping in touch, and other media that we're getting, the internet information that we're getting, to break it down into themes. This is what I do, and I have a new lecture coming out on December 21st. You can find it on my website, mothersguide.com. And I talk about the need to whittle down what we're supposed to be paying attention to, whittle it down to themes, and to break down the symbolism of Uranus and the symbolism of Pluto. It's very useful, because then you can understand all the things Uranus governs, which is, for example, internet, for another example, freedom, and see what it's up against, which are really Pluto's meaning in this instance, is those who have the power, the 1%. And Pluto, all through the ages, has meant this. So it's really spelled out for us. And then we start to be able to have a perspective, enough to go back to, for example, in even very recent history, under George Bush W., they were trying, do you remember, to pass that hideous surveillance program called Total Information Awareness?
Oh, yeah.
It was in the first term of the Bush administration, and Congress killed it in 2003 because it caused this huge outcry about its potential for invading Americans' privacy. Well, the exact same thing is going on right now. But they actually renamed it and got it passed. There's the trespass bill and the NDAA, and all of these Patriot Act type of outrageous Big Brother mechanisms are being passed and being not given, relatively speaking, a peep of protest to, because I think of this amazing avalanche of information. So I think we need themes. That's my punchline in this paragraph.
Yeah, when you said about the total information awareness stuff. They had a thing back in '03, and this was should have been an alert to anybody who was paying attention that things have really gone off the rails, which is it was that you could bet on when the next terrorist attack could take place.
Oh my gosh.
And they got, who was the guy? He was one of the criminals from the Iran-Contra scandal that was in the Bush administration.
Ollie North.
No, not him. There was another one of these guys, but one of these type of guys.
Crazy guys.
Yeah, another one of these types who
Mm-hmm.
A
couple of them disappeared for a while and then reemerged without a hair rumpled,
like slime or something.
Yeah.
But you could bet on when the next event was going to happen.
Uh-huh.
And they thought it was a way of applying the financial, it was basically like a stock market idea.
Yeah, it's amoral. It's like post-moral.
Yeah,
that kind of a thing.
And it was that, and then a few years later, they cloned a sheep that looked a lot like John Kerry. So I think in between those two those two events,
Lord, help us.
It was like between those two events, should have been an alert to anybody that La La Land. We're not even in La La Land anymore, Jessica. La La Land is in the rearview mirror, and I don't know where we're at, but
yeah. Well, things are changing so fast, and the dangers are cloaked by a highly sophisticated spin operation, that we need something else to understand what's going on. And of course, you and I believe that astrological archetypes are just the thing. Because if you get what the theme is of a given era, which is very plain, it's written down in black and white by the transits, then you can see a cohesive, kind of an organizing device. And then when those transits go into a peak, for example, like the 7 peaks of the Uranus-Pluto square, 2 of which we've already had. Last one was in last month in September around the equinox. Boy, was that full of action. When you get what the peaks are, you're forewarned of whatever event happens. We don't know what is specifically going to happen, but we know, because we're forewarned, what it's going to mean. So, for example, the free speech versus police state theme, that's a theme. And then when this H.R. 347 comes up, that was passed last March, the anti-Occupy bill, some people call it. George Clooney got arrested. You know the one I mean?
Oh, yeah.
So when that passes, we can look at it and fit it in to a framework of understanding. And the NDAA, this indefinite detention bill that was passed actually on New Year's Eve 2011. And you know that that's another Pluto agency. These are the clandestine espionage networks that exactly fit the definition of Pluto. And you see, for example, the people who protest against it, like Occupy and like our beloved old father, Noam Chomsky, the father of American radicalism, and Chris Hedges, a wonderful journalist, you know how they all sued the government because of NDAA, and that's still pending. And we know that they're the Uranus figures. So we've got the Uranus square Pluto, and it's all laid out. You remember when, just for one more example, this one really got under my skin. Do you remember when Israel put some kind of a travel ban on Günter Grass?
No, I don't.
The German, this was a while ago, in April. And was it this April? I don't remember, but he had written criticizing the Israeli government, Netanyahu's government. Not Judaism, but just the government and their reactionary policies. And they put a travel ban on him. And then you can, especially someone like you who looks at mundane astrology and group charts, you can look at the chart of Israel. And through using astrology this way, you can track what's happening in terms of meaning and decide what you're going to pay attention to, number one, talked about that, and number two, what side you're on, in a way. Whether you're on the side of the Uranian forces of freedom and individualism and real democracy, or the reactive Pluto forces, which is, the 1%, and the powerful agencies that are really like cabals now, like multinational corporations and the international banking industry, and how they buy off the democracies that are supposed to be the government.
You want a pair of astro twins that may blow your mind?
Say that again.
A pair of astro twins,
Twins?
like a same sun-moon combination. Here's one for you.
Yeah, let's hear it.
The Federal Reserve is
Yes.
Capricorn Sun, Scorpio Moon.
Right.
The show The Sopranos, using its premiere date as its date of birth, is a Capricorn Sun, Scorpio Moon.
Very interesting.
Yeah. Now, obviously, for folks listening, there are higher expressions of that pairing.
Yes, well, I wanted to thank you for making that point, because we can decide whether we want to use either of these planets. So to talk about it as being which side you're on is really deeply misleading. That just plays into the dualistic, viewpoint that they really want us to stay in. This is about, essentially, are you on the side of the new or the old that's dying?
Would you say one way to think about it is, are you on the side of pro-centralization or decentralization? So
That's an interesting way to put it.
yeah, that comes from a gal named Catherine Austin Fitz.
Yes, she's wonderful.
Yeah, and if her astro twins, the honey badger. Have you seen this honey badger video?
Mm-mm. No. What the
Well,
hell is that?
the honey badger is the most bad you know what animal on the planet, and there's this this National Geographic video of the honey badger that's narrated by this very very flamboyant gay man. It's one of the most popular YouTube videos of all time.
It's a real mammal that
Yeah.
likes honey.
Well, it eats cobra, among other things.
I see.
And it just, you got to look it up on YouTube. And I
Cobra
looked at,
eating badger.
yeah, it'll eat cobra. And as you will find out, the honey badger just don't give a, you know what, the honey badger takes what he wants.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, well, Catherine Austin Fitz, who went head to head with some very powerful agencies, I looked at her chart, Capricorn, Sun, Cancer, Moon, like the honey badger.
Huh.
And I thought, yeah, Catherine is a honey badger. You have to.
Yeah. And what degree is she getting the Pluto conjunction right now?
I don't remember. I remember it was in December that her birthday was. So she'd be getting it.
Yeah.
It'd be pretty close.
See, this is exactly, as you say, the higher vibration of Pluto is the one that can accept, essentially, that some things are rotten, that their corruption has gotten to the point where they are no longer functional, and therefore to cling to them would be like clinging to a zombie. This thing has got to go. And the natural devolution process has to be respected. So the higher version of Pluto is to realize that there are deaths here, endings, that are utterly natural and organic, that need to be honored so that the new beginnings can move in as relatively smoothly. That's the only question. Is the death of this old era going to be horribly painful or relatively smooth? The question is not, is the era going to die? It's dying. And anybody who's broken through their own denial can see that. But that should be a point of celebration. Which reminds me, by the way, to bring up the Mayans, which are, I talk about this at length in my lecture on December 21st that you can download. So I won't go into it in detail here, but this whole nonsense about the last day of the world happening on December 21st of this year is missing this whole point of Pluto, which is that natural law dictates that everything that ends is only doing it so that something new can begin. There's no such thing as an ending in a vacuum.
I've wondered if not the actual Mayan calendar, obviously, but the hype over it, if that was some type of like corporate government psychological operation.
They would both be governed by Pluto, and one would be, to pull the wool over people's eyes so that they didn't go into the deeper implications of this cyclic way of looking at life, which if they did, it would free them.
Yeah, it's like
they would actually be free, not scared, but free.
The phrase is, there's a phrase that they use when they run propaganda. I mean, technically on other countries, but the same techniques are now used here.
Right.
You can even see this in old CIA and USAID manuals. I forget the phrase of it, but it's a diversion. So everybody's freaked out. They know something's up, and then
I do think that those are going on.
And so then everybody's like, oh, the Mayan calendar. And meanwhile,
anything to make people feel powerless and spooked out.
Yeah. Or just to get thinking that it all happens in one day as opposed to a slower, drawn-out process.
Well, this is the fundamentalist view from Islamic fundamentalists to the Christian kind, which has this amazingly literal take on these ancient truths. It never ceases to amaze me how literally they can take something which is obviously a metaphor. But that's the kind of simplistic thinking that it doesn't matter what your belief system is. If you can go no further than that kind of black and white literal thinking, then that's the way you're going to channel the Uranus-Pluto years, which are not going to be very comfortable for you then.
We've got just a couple of minutes left. So the election and the debates and what is not. Do you have any astrological take on what is not? Everybody's talking about who won and who lost and what's talked about.
Well, that again, the short view right? Instead of taking the long view, which astrology forces us to take. You know, if we use this idea that the planetary cycles are themes, and we use the transits to show us what's coming to a head, we can see, for example, that this class warfare business, which unaccountably got turned into a salvo against the left by the right, when actually the phrase class warfare is an astoundingly accurate description of exactly what's going on. Class warfare, which it took a couple years, but the Occupy movement finally got born and used that idea to usher into the group mind the reality that we're talking about, which is there is income inequality. And that wonderful slogan, "We are the 99%," completely summed it up. So it's such a huge, unavoidable fact of American life. You know, all the numbers point to it. In fact, when Occupy was just last month, celebrating its one-year anniversary, there was this new survey that came out saying that the 400 richest Americans enjoyed a 13% increase in wealth over this past year to $1.7 trillion. I mean, any survey you look at, it makes that reality of class warfare so obvious that the spin machine, to make it not obvious, really has had to come up with some torturous justifications, like this whole job creators nonsense that completely denies the way that the economy really works, which are the middle class consumers really are the job creators, because that's, you know, job growth relies on consumer demand.
Yeah, it's almost like the propaganda here has gotten to if you look at the old Soviet propaganda in the very last days.
Oh, it's the same techniques.
Yeah, where it was anybody outside the Soviet Union could see that it was not, it was so.
That's right. And that's what anybody who turns off their TV set,
yeah,
or, you know, the mass media in America right now would see the truth. They'd be analogous to the non-Soviets.
right.
I know we're out of time. I just want to say the other piece that I also have a lecture on, so if people are interested, they can go to Pluto and the death of the age of oil. I think that's a second major theme that this election is really about, but they're not talking about, which is our dependence, the whole modern world's dependence upon oil.
Right.
The addiction that is. And Pluto governs addiction, and Uranus governs freedom. So this is the time to look at it in those terms.
Right. Well, Jessica, what you said, people should turn off their TVs, and I always tell them they should turn off their TVs and listen to cows. And now they can also, if they want to know what's really going on, then go to your website, right? Which is, how did they get, what's
mothersky.com.
That's right. And so thank you so much for being on. It has been
It's a pleasure, Matt.
All right, thank you. And we'll have the MP3s posted probably this weekend.
Great.
So, okay.
Thanks so much.
Talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, folks, I'm going to take a break, and we have another guest calling in.
Just
Whoa, oops. All right, I'm just going to put on some music while we get ready for our next guest. So here we go.